March 21st, 2008. The road leading from the city of Tambov towards Kotovsk. A Lada of the 15th model is driving along the highway, the only car for many kilometers in both directions. Inside the car there are two young guys with serious faces. Dmitry Gerasimov and Dmitry Zaitsev are carrying out an important assignment given to them personally by Kaban Tambovsky, the Tambov criminal authority, Aleksandr Ladehin. In the trunk of the car, beaten unconscious, lies the bloodied businessman Vladislav Polikarpov. Gerasimov and Zaitsev, on Ladehin's orders, must take his life and dispose of the body. Neither of them knows that Polikarpov has already regained consciousness and is now trying to get out of the trunk and save his life. In the turbulent 90s, Tambov was considered one of the most criminal cities in Russia and could even compete for the title of criminal capital with Moscow itself or even gangster Petersburg. The Tambov gang operated not only in their hometown but also in Petersburg. The notorious organized crime group Tambovskaya was considered one of the most influential in the northern capital and often appeared in criminal chronicles, as did its leader Vladimir Kumarin Barsukov. Robberies, contract killings, trafficking in illegal substances, arson. The Tambovskaya, like other gangs, did not shy away from anything to achieve their goals. In Tambov itself, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a harsh criminal clan system. At that time, the governor of Tambov Oblast was once again Oleg Betin. In total, he would serve in this position 4 times, and in the future, more than 20 of his assistants and acquaintances would become involved in various criminal cases. Many of them would successfully avoid responsibility. Widespread corruption in government bodies and the relative weakness of the state allowed criminal groups and clans to freely divide spheres of influence with almost nothing to fear. For example, the clan of Pop Andrei Popov controlled the Tambov central market and food trade. The clan of Sava Yuri Savenkov controlled charity, and the influential Kurdish clan led by Jamal Shamayan was engaged in controlling the illegal trafficking of prohibited substances. Aleksandr Ladehin, nicknamed Kaban, controlled the Tambov car market and the oil business. The criminal enterprise functioned based on a well-defined plan. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there were mass contract bankruptcies of solvent enterprises in the region. With the help of such bankruptcies, property ended up in the hands of people connected by secret agreements. These were agreements between government officials, law enforcement officers, and leaders of criminal groups. Reports suggested that in Tambov, the authorities had nearly fully integrated with organized crime syndicates. That's exactly how it was. The bandits felt practically untouchable, immune to the law. Whatever they did, they got away with it. Aleksandr Ladehin was confident in his invulnerability and that he would get away with everything. There is practically no biography of Aleksandr Ladehin available on the internet. There are only scattered bits of information about his work as a lawyer in the Second Bar Association of Moscow, but there is no information about his personal life or family. It is known that Ladehin was a distinctive figure in criminal circles, although not a unique one. A lawyer by education, in the early 90s he worked as an operative in the Oktyabrski District Department of Internal Affairs in Tambov and later moved to Moscow, where he began practicing law. However, this did not prevent him from controlling the activities of his group and maintaining close contacts with the local law enforcement authorities. Former colleagues from law enforcement assured Ladehin that he could always count on them. He knew he could rely on them. He knew they would hardly ever refuse him any request. And on that day, March 21st, 2008, Ladehin's friends did not let him down. On the night of March 20th to 21st, the Ryabina Café in Tambov was crowded. In the hall, besides other visitors, there was a small group of people. 36-year-old businessman Vladislav Polikarpov was celebrating his birthday. Nothing extravagant, no outsiders, just close people, business partners and friends. The group partied almost until 4 in the morning, and by that time nearly all the guests and the host himself were drunk. Around 4 in the morning, a late guest, Aleksandr Ladehin, arrived at the cafe accompanied by bodyguards, employees of the Boyard Tea Company, as well as one former employee of the security company Общество с ограниченной ответственностью. Apparently, Polikarpov and Ladehin were not close friends, but they communicated quite often. Ladehin knew that it was Polikarpov's birthday and decided to stop by and congratulate him. He entered the hall and warmly greeted the birthday man, Nika. Nika invited him to the table and a conversation started between the men. But while Ladehin and his friend were talking peacefully, at the other end of the hall the atmosphere almost immediately began to heat up. Ladehin's bodyguard, an employee of Общество с ограниченной ответственностью, and Polikarpov's friend almost immediately started talking in raised voices. The reason for the conflict is not reliably known, but soon the whole hall was looking toward the men. One of the cafe employees asked both of the arguers to calm down before the quarrel turned into a fight. But it was already too late, words could no longer solve anything. To the credit of both men, they still managed to force themselves to leave the cafe and sort things out outside. As soon as the door closed behind the arguers, they got into a fistfight. A brawl broke out. It was caught on the surveillance cameras near the cafe. Ladehin's bodyguard was stronger and tougher, and besides, he was sober. Soon his opponent could barely get up from the snow-covered pavement. The noise brought out Ladehin himself and Polikarpov, who was in a drunken rage. "Take him away from here," he barked, pointing at his beaten friend. While the bloodied man, sobered up from the pain, was being loaded into the car, Polikarpov turned to Ladehin and told him exactly what he thought of his bodyguards, and at the same time of him as well. He didn't hold back in his language. He just wanted to celebrate his birthday in good company, just to sit with friends, have a drink, and talk. Ladehin and his friends ruined everything. It was Ladehin's fault, Ladehin and his friend the bodyguard. Ladehin stood up for his colleague, reminding everyone that Polikarpov's friend was drunk and was the one who started the conflict. If he got beaten up, it was entirely his own fault. At some point, friends turned into bitter enemies. Polikarpov was drunk. He wasn't even thinking about what he was saying anymore. A stream of foul language was pouring down on him. Ladehin felt humiliated. Some businessman was cursing him out right in front of his own people. He came to congratulate his friend on his birthday and have a good time, but it turned out that his friend didn't think very highly of him. How does this kid dare to say such things to his face, to Kaban himself? Ladehin boiled with anger, his eyes darkened. He turned to his men and ordered, "We're leaving, and you." He faced Polikarpov and said, "I won't let this go. You know who I am. You'll regret it." Polikarpov and his company slammed the door as they returned inside the building, leaving Ladehin and his friends outside. He was burning with the desire to punish his offender, to show Polikarpov who was in charge here, but he needed help. Polikarpov had to be punished in such a way that others would also understand that it's not worth crossing Kaban. At 4:40, Ladehin called one of his friends, Yevgeny Vereshchagin, who worked in the police. The sources indicate that he held a managerial position. On the audio recording of the conversation, which would later become one of the pieces of evidence of what happened, you can hear how emotionally Ladehin begs Zhenka to send him people. In fact, the materials, both video and the audio recordings being discussed, will be available on the Strashnoti Telegram channel. The link is under the video. "Give me people, quickly, specialists, give me people, give me," he repeats over and over again, mixing his requests with profanity. He made the same requests to another acquaintance of his, Vadim Roshkov. Ladehin didn't just need a couple more people to add to those he already had with him. He wanted to assemble a real squad for retribution. Despite the early morning, both friends responded to the request immediately. Very soon, a couple dozen people arrived by car at the Continent Trading House, which was located not far from the cafe. All of them were young, strong men, ready to obey Ladehin without question. The exact number of people sent to Ladehin as reinforcements is unknown. The camera recorded about 20 people, but according to eyewitness accounts, there were at least twice as many. It is assumed that part of the reinforcements were simply outside the camera's field of view. Some simply stayed outside to prevent Polikarpov and his friends from escaping. Among those who came to help Ladehin were Dmitry Gerasimov and Dmitry Zaitsev. It is they who will play one of the main roles in what happens next. The men approached Ladehin to receive instructions. Ladehin was still agitated after the argument, and seeing the reinforcements only made his excitement stronger. He now commanded a small army, and he felt like the all-powerful master of the situation. The others needed to understand this as well. He called Gerasimov and Zaitsev closer. The instructions were clear. Go inside, beat up everyone present without sparing anyone, and as for Polikarpov himself, after beating him up first, take him out of the cafe. If he resists, drag him out. Ladehin had already thought up a separate, harsh punishment for him. He didn't care that the other guests in the cafe were just random city residents who had come here to relax. Even in Polikarpov's group, there were those who hadn't taken part in the conflict at all, but that no longer mattered. Everyone had to answer for the insults to Ladehin. Polikarpov himself had to pay with his life. Gerasimov, Zaitsev, and the other guys who had come to the cafe weren't bothered at all by such an order. Many of those so-called reinforcements of specialists had probably taken part in something like this more than once before. Both guys were ready to get their hands dirty with blood. They listened to the instructions and nodded, "We'll do it." There were chains and metal rods specially prepared for this purpose lying in the car. The group that came to Ryabina knew exactly what Ladehin would require of them. Armed with chains and rods, the men headed to the cafe and entered without hesitation. They immediately headed to the table where Polikarpov was sitting. No one hid their weapons or their intentions. The visitors noticed the crowd of people that suddenly appeared in the hall, but they didn't have time to really understand anything. 24 strong men swung chains and rods, and a real massacre began. They beat everyone indiscriminately. On the head, the torso, the limbs, bloody splatters flew in all directions. Screams rang out. Gerasimov, Zaitsev, and their assistants spared no one. Even the establishment's employees got caught in the crossfire, as did the administrator who tried to rein in the people who burst into the building and stood up for the female staff. As a result of the massacre, 7 people sustained serious injuries that required them to seek medical attention at the hospital. Polikarpov was dragged out from behind the table, thrown to the floor, and beaten with particular brutality. None of the visitors were armed, and they had nothing to defend themselves against the blows from the rod and chains. At first, Polikarpov tried to protect his vital organs with his hands, curling up on the floor, but soon, from the intense pain, he lost consciousness. After some time, deciding that Ladehin's offenders had learned their lesson well enough, the group left Ryabina. The wounded Polikarpov, barely able to stand, was hauled out of the cafe. On the video footage from the cameras, you can see Ladehin himself beating the semi-conscious Polikarpov and threatening him with a pistol. By that time, the businessman was barely conscious from the pain, so it wasn't difficult to load him into the trunk of Ladehin's car. Ladehin felt no remorse as he looked at the unconscious body of his former friend being shoved into the trunk. Gerasimov and Zaitsev. He didn't care that just an hour ago he and Polikarpov had been sitting at the same table talking about life. Polikarpov's face and head were smashed, blood was dripping from his mouth. But for Ladehin that wasn't enough. He intended to finish the job. He didn't care about the consequences, didn't care that the cafe's visitors surely knew who was responsible for the bloody carnage unfolding in the building. He didn't care that if Polikarpov didn't return home, he would become the prime suspect. Ladehin was a big shot, a criminal authority. He had connections, money, and on top of that, a lawyer's license in his pocket. Ladehin was confident that nothing threatened him, not even for causing someone's death. He had power and authority on his side. He turned to Gerasimov and Zaitsev and gave a clear order. Once again, Polikarpov had to be taken out of the city and killed. They had to get rid of the body without leaving any traces. Report back once the task was done. The other assistants were dismissed. When the cars drove away from the cafe, Ladehin called his friends Vereshchagin and Roskhov again. On the audio recording of the conversation, his voice sounds much calmer. He is satisfied and keeps repeating, "Thank you, brother. I will never forget this. I owe you for life." It was 5:40 in the morning on the 21st of March 2008. The whole incident at the Ryabina Café took only an hour. The car with Polikarpov in the trunk left the city and headed toward the village of Bokina, which is less than 15 kilometers from Tambov. The criminals intended to carry out Ladyokin's instructions precisely. They also felt no pity for the man lying in the trunk. After a while, Polikarpov regained consciousness from the pain and shaking. At first, he probably didn't understand where he was or what was happening, but then his mind cleared. He most likely guessed what would happen next. He knew Ladehin well as his gangster methods of dealing with those he considered useless. People were poured into cement, thrown into pits, burned and shot. The 2000s were in many ways more brutal than the 90s. The most criminal year wasn't in the 90s, but in the 2000s, and the methods didn't go anywhere. The car was driving at a decent speed on the highway, but soon turned onto a country road. The speed dropped a little, the shaking intensified, and the car started driving off-road. This could be the only chance for Polikarpov, the only chance for salvation. He understood that as soon as the car stopped, he would have no chance to escape. He pushed the trunk door and it opened, not paying attention to the pain in his head. It will be determined posthumously that he suffered a severe traumatic brain injury and broken bones. Polikarpov forced himself to sit up and roll over the edge, risking getting caught under the wheels. His battered body tumbled out onto the snow and rolled across it. While Polikarpov was gathering his strength to get up, the car suddenly stopped. Gerasimov and Zaitsev heard and saw in the rearview mirror how the trunk of the car opened. They realized that the victim, beaten half to death with broken bones, was nevertheless trying to escape. Polikarpov managed to get to his feet, but he didn't have time to get far. The businessman was doomed from the start. Two strong men easily caught up with him and knocked him down into the snow. This time, Polikarpov was beaten with their feet. They didn't beat him for long. He almost immediately lost consciousness again. Then the businessman was placed in the car, and the vehicle started moving. It didn't take long. Soon the car stopped in a field near the village next to the Tsina River, about half a kilometer from the road leading to Kotovsk. It was early morning and still dark. Gerasimov and Zaitsev dragged Polikarpov out of the car. The almost unconscious businessman was stabbed 8 times in the chest, abdomen and neck. According to other sources, there were 16 wounds. The blows were inflicted by Gerasimov. The victim could not scream or call for help. Polikarpov almost immediately lost consciousness again and died from his wounds. When it became clear that the job was done, Gerasimov and Zaitsev hid the businessman's body in a field, covering it with branches. They intended to get rid of the body just as Ladehin had ordered, but they didn't have any tools with them. It was decided to return to the city, get some shovels and come back to the crime scene to bury the body. That evening, that's exactly what they did. They buried the body in the frozen ground in the middle of a deserted field. The pit that the criminals dug turned out to be too shallow, so to fit the frozen body of the businessman in it, Gerasimov jumped on it. The job was done. Ladehin, who literally left Tambov that same day and went back to Moscow, was informed that Polikarpov had been eliminated. By that time, the whole city already knew about the incident, and it was being discussed by the federal media. The Russian television and radio channel aired more than 10 reports about the massacre at the Ryabina Café, discussing the criminal lawlessness of the event. Vladislav Polikarpov did not return home after he was taken away from the café by car, and the investigation immediately assumed that he was dead. At the same time, it turned out that the person who ordered the beating of Ladehin was no longer in the city of Sredstvia. They reviewed the surveillance camera footage, and the attackers began to be detained one after another. Many, including Rasimov and Zaitsev, remained at large for now. The case was gaining more and more public attention. The public was outraged by the very fact of what had happened and demanded that the person responsible, who, because of his personal animosity, ordered a dozen innocent people to be beaten and kidnapped and possibly even killed, be punished. Journalists, officials, and heads of law enforcement agencies poured into the city, those who just yesterday had claimed that the crime situation in the city was no cause for concern. Today, people suddenly started talking about how criminal gangs rule the roost in Tambov and that the attack on the patrons of the Rayabina Café is a challenge to law enforcement and the authorities. The problem was that law enforcement agencies were involved in the case no less than the mastermind behind the crime. Vladislav Polikarpov's mother, Taisia, demanded her son be found immediately and the abductor punished. A preventive measure in the form of detention was chosen in absentia for Aleksandr Ladehin. However, from the very first day it became clear that things were not so simple. As it turned out, Ladehin, who had left the city, could not be detained. He was a lawyer of the Second Bar Association of Moscow and had attorney immunity. This meant that procedural coercive measures could not be applied to him even when he was charged with organizing a kidnapping. Ladehin understood this perfectly. At the same time, he realized that he would not remain a lawyer for long, that sooner or later he would be stripped of his title. And then, after all, he would have to go to the pretrial detention center. This could have happened after Polikarpov's body was discovered, or perhaps even before that. One way or another, he didn't have much time. He couldn't miss the chance to escape responsibility, so that's what he did. He fled from Russia to Germany. Only after Ledyokin was stripped of his lawyer's title by the decision of the Oktyabrsky District Court of Tambov was he declared wanted throughout Russia. This happened at the end of April 2008, but it was already too late. There is information that Ledyokin came to Tambov even after he was stripped of his lawyer's title. The police knew about this, but Ledyokin was not detained. However, the attention to the case did not diminish. On May 4th, the leadership of the Civil Congress of the Tambov region appealed to the Prosecutor General of Russia, demanding a full investigation into the disappearance and possible death of Vladislav Polikarpov. All this time, the investigation was searching for Polikarpov, realizing that he was most likely no longer alive. However, something unexpected happened soon after. The businessman's widow suddenly claimed that Vladislav had called her quite recently and that he was healthy and everything was fine with him. However, she added, he doesn't say where he is or what happened to him. She repeatedly insisted to relatives and investigators that her husband was still alive. I spoke with him, I can't be mistaken. However, it soon became clear that the woman had not received any calls from her husband. The widow Polikarpova was bribed by police officers Boris Lewandowski and Yuri Kartunov. The woman was offered money in exchange for lying about her husband. The exact amount is unknown, but for Polikarpova it was enough. Knowing for certain that her husband was no longer alive, she agreed to pretend that he was talking to her. But that was not all. During the investigation, it turned out that employees of the Oktyabrsky Department of the District Internal Affairs Office, the very place where Ladehin once worked, had allegedly accidentally destroyed important fragments of surveillance camera footage near the café and in the hall. The key evidence that could have enabled an accurate chronology of the incident. The lost fragments were only recovered closer to the beginning of autumn, and in the middle of autumn the body of Vladislav Polikarpov was finally discovered. This happened after Dmitry Gerasimov was finally detained on October 1st. He confessed to everything and told where they had taken the life of and buried the unwanted businessman. On October 8th, the body of Vladislav Polikarpov was exhumed from the ground. In the summer of 2010, the Tambov Regional Court handed down a sentence to the direct perpetrators of the crime. Dmitry Gerasimov was found guilty of hooliganism and of taking a person's life out of hooligan motives and was sentenced to 17 years in a high-security penal colony. Dmitry Zaitsev was found guilty of hooliganism and organizing the taking of a person's life and received 12 years. Other participants in the mass beating, Aleksandr Gaidukov, Sergei Shipkov, Andrei Yakovlev, Alexei Averin and others, received various sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years. By this same verdict, two police officers, Boris Lewandowski and Yuri Kartunov, were found guilty of bribing a witness to give knowingly false testimony. They bribed Polikarpov's wife. However, they were released from criminal liability because the statute of limitations for prosecution had expired. However, Ladehin managed to evade justice for quite a long time. Only after almost 7 years, in mid-December 2014, did the police receive information that he was back in Russia, specifically in the Moscow region. He was detained and placed in pre-trial detention. Information immediately appeared in the media that he was facing a life sentence, but it remained just information. Already in March 2015, 57-year-old Aleksandr Ladehin was released from custody, and according to some sources, the criminal prosecution against him was dropped. Afterwards, he often visited Tambov. His further fate is unknown. The widow of Vladislav Polikarpov remarried a short time after her husband's death.